welcome, Justina. Really happy to have you, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
I want to thank everybody for inviting me, and I really enjoyed the first part of this meeting a great deal. And I think a lot of the messages that I'm going to be conveying here, which take us way outside this watershed at first and then bring it home, hopefully, will be very complementary to your mandate, your work, and what we've already heard and will hear for the rest of the day. So, you know, my title obviously is very complementary to what you're working on, and essentially, I mean, you know, the COVID pandemic is very importantly and exclusively focused on addressing the symptoms of a necessary response to the crisis of the pandemic. And really what we're going to talk about here is also just sort of how to address what we're finding out about addressing the root causes of this, but then even closer to home, how we can be more resilient to impacts in the future, and how these root causes are becoming increasingly evident. The story is really going to start very far away from here, because I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about kind of how we got to where we are today in terms of this pandemic and what that says about, you know, environmental health, essentially, and reducing the vulnerability of communities to pandemics. But the punchline is that all of this elevates the importance of the watershed approach here closer to home, and which is exemplified by initiatives like the Healthy Lake Huron in Southern Ontario, not to mention conservation authorities, which are a bit in the firing line today. So we'll see what happens. But really where the watershed mandate is so critically important. I'm speaking to you today as president and senior scientist of Wildlife Conservation Society Canada. And for those of you who don't know about us, many probably don't, is we're very behind the scenes. We're an organization of conservation scientists who work at a national scale. We've been incorporated for about 15 years and are affiliated with a larger WCS. And why that's relevant is that the larger WCS has a huge wildlife health program and epidemiologists, which have been really helpful for understanding sort of where we are today. And so I'm coming to you from a perspective as a wildlife biologist. I'm active in biodiversity conservation, but also, you know, managing an organization of biologists who are working in the service of conservation. And we have programs in wildlife health, climate, biodiversity policy, and so on that affect the broader land base, but we're also kind of boots on the ground in particular geographies that are shown here on this map. I also have a bit of a history with this subject, is that I was a member of the first Lake Simcoe Science Advisory Committee that was formed just before the Act came into place. And an interesting anecdote from that experience is that I was the only terrestrial biologist that was invited onto the advisory committee. And literally when I walked into the room the first day, a number of the other scientists in the room, you know, water quality specialists, focused mostly on the lake, you know, almost entirely on the lake itself, asked me like what I was doing there, and searched in the terms of reference. I mean, they did so politely, but you know, there was a big question mark about why I needed to be in the room during the discussions. And you know, needless to say, they let me stay. But fast forward to the actual report that we produced a year or so later, and then you know, sort of some of the way that this was you know, played out in the protection plan itself, is that you know, the health of that watershed became, and the natural heritage element of the plan became extremely important. I mean, was one of the larger chapters in these particular reports that I'm showing you the cover of. And you know, that has led to a lot of our feeling in, you know, the presentations that we heard today about how, you know, the health of the land, the forest, the wetlands, and so forth is so important. And so that experience was very informative for that point of view. Zoonoses are diseases that move between animals and humans, and that's what we're experiencing today. And spillover happens when a virus that is normally present in an animal host is transmitted to a new host. And the very important statistic is that among emerging or novel diseases that are appearing these days, 72% of them have originated in wildlife, and the rest from domestic animals. But 72% from wildlife, and that's really important. There are a lot of viruses on the planet, and we only understand a fraction of them. About 700,000 of them could have the potential to infect humans that we even know, but we only understand about 250 of them that have been identified in humans. And the rest are still out there, they just haven't made the leap, and normally they don't make the leap. It's very, you have to have the right constellation of factors that allow for that leap, and then even more less possibility of having it be pandemic proportions. But the importance is that infectious disease outbreak event frequency is increasing, and we know all of these: HIV, Ebola, H1N1, SARS, Nipah, Hendra, H7N9, and almost very few of these originated in North America, but we feel the impacts, and we need to shore up resilience. But we're not out of the woods entirely, and I'll explain why that is the case. The particular constellation of factors that occurred in this and the SARS epidemic just immediately before are things that we don't have in Canada or in North America, which are these wildlife markets, in particular, live animals living on top of each other that never occur naturally in the environment. They're brought out from their natural environment and under the most unnatural of circumstances, and in indoor spaces with lots and lots of people. And these are very, very special circumstances, but they've occurred more or less. We now have two pandemics, although the second one is just ridiculously more severe than where we know that the pandemic was sparked in this kind of circumstance. There's a lot of virus sleuthing going on in terms of how that happened and who was the culprit in this case. Where did it leap from? In both SARS and this particular COVID-19, which is a variant of SARS, the first host are bats, but bats are themselves that reflects, of course, lots of bats have viruses, most of which do not affect them at all, and these then are harmless to bats, but when you provide opportunities for spillover, this is the kind of thing that happened. In the SARS event, we know that the spillover animal was a civet, and we don't know in this circumstance at all. And we probably never will, because the market was cleaned out very quickly and no samples were taken from any of the wildlife. Environmental samples that were taken all point to this one particular section of the market, but that's about all we know. So, and while there's this strong signal of the origin of the pandemic, there's no absolute proof. But that doesn't really matter as much as understanding that it's really about the ongoing destruction of nature that will result in these diseases jumping from animals to humans. And as author, David Quammen wrote recently, he said, quote, we disrupt ecosystems and we shake viruses loose from their natural hosts. And when that happens, they need a new host. Often we are it. And the bottom line is that opportunities are increasing on the planet for unknown viruses to spill over. And the increases in expansion of human activity is breaking down the natural buffer that once protected us. And a lot of very important United Nations groups and WHO and so forth are really highlighting this in this current pandemic as it drags on in a way that never happened before. The UNEP itself released a report in July emphasizing how critically important it is to get to the root causes, and without going into them, many of which are in the tropics, a lot of them sort of play out here and are relevant in ways that I'll get into in a minute. And so we talked about the wildlife markets, that super interface, which is incredibly novel, but the initial spark was with environmental degradation out in the hinterland, and then bringing forward punching roads into areas that haven't been penetrated, and bringing these animals out or causing more opportunities for them to interact with humans. And there are many ways for that to happen. I'm not going to go into it. We wrote a report about this early on in the pandemic to really show how, and this is relevant also to temperate zones as well, but how this particular the stamp of environmental degradation, outright deforestation, but also other parts as well. So at the same time, we also have a growing appreciation through science about the importance of nature for human existence and good quality of life. This report that came out last year by the equivalent, sort of the analog to IPCC, which we all know much better for climate change, but this was the first global report by the International Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And that report is tied to the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's sort of the other kind of crisis that's playing out. And the headlines were mostly about the million species that are facing extinction. But what is really important and was, in my view, about this report that it brought out in better ways than ever had been seen before was the critical essentiality of nature for human existence and good quality of life. And this was shown in many, many ways. And, you know, the parts that didn't get headlines was that 14 of the 18 categories of contribution of nature that were assessed, mostly regulating and non-material contributions, have declined considerably. We devastate wildlife, we eliminate entire species, but at the same time, we're squeezing those left into perverse and dangerous configurations, and then we jeopardize our own health. The risk of zoonotic emerging infections is really elevated in forested tropical regions, and that's shown by the yellow hotspots on this map. And this really important paper that came out a few years ago before this pandemic used sort of a constellation of factors that sort of lead to high risk. And this is, of course, just a model. But there are a number of factors, that key ingredients that accentuate the risk, and these range from land conversion and creation of habitat edges, wildlife trade and consumption, agricultural intensification, human population, and then also mammalian diversity. And so a lot of those factors are really high, particularly in Asia. But a lot of folks also think that this map is a bit downplaying the risk in Central Africa and particularly Latin America, where some of those same issues are. And you can see that Europe and North America is not entirely off the hook. I mean, we do have agricultural intensification here, we do have high human populations, and we do have land degradation. So these are things that we have to be concerned about. And we do indeed have a bunch of major zoonotic diseases of public health importance in Canada. I'm not going to go into them, but just to say that these are being tracked to some extent, mostly in a pretty reactive fashion, just because there isn't a heck of a lot of capacity. But wildlife can be an important barometer and indicator of overall health of a system. And while not all of wildlife diseases by any stretch are important, these are important because we are also seeing growing concerns about zoonotic diseases, but also wildlife diseases as well that are increasing, some of which we don't understand the relationship well enough in terms of how vulnerable we are to those, but need to be monitored. And then a lot of our other monitoring is just not happening in a particularly robust, proactive way. It's really by necessity, given budgets, happening quite reactively, and that's not the best position to be on. Of course, is on our heels. Bringing this to Southern Ontario context, of course, our landscape has been heavily modified here, hugely so. We've seen slides to show that. We all know that wetlands and forests are a shadow of what they once used to be. And the overall biodiversity of the region has been vastly simplified and homogenized. Note there's not one person on this call that doesn't know that, so I certainly won't belabor that point. Probably our poster child of kind of the relationship between biodiversity decline and emerging infectious disease is Lyme disease, although this is somewhat controversial in terms of really the mechanisms that are happening and probably simplified. But it is, deforestation and Lyme disease do have a correlation in Eastern North America. And the bacterium that causes Lyme disease is transmitted by ticks that rely on forest-dwelling deer to breed and obtain enough blood to survive. But the bacterium is also found in white-footed mouse, which happens to thrive in forests fragmented by human settlements, where you've got a much more simplified small mammal community. They're really resilient, this species. They're generalists. They can get in everywhere. And so when human populations expand and approach areas, you know, they thrive. And they're the ones most likely to transmit these ticks, and they can infect lots of, they can, you know, they have bacteria that causes Lyme, and the rest is history. And we know that that's been increasing in Canada over just the past recent 5 or 6 years in particular. So it's something, you know, it's one of the things that we have to be watching out for. These are not pandemics at all, but they're sort of slow moving kind of problems, or that can collectively lead to a lot bigger problems over time. And that's the kind of thing that we have to watch out for. It's not that we're going to spark these enormous crises, but these slow moving things are difficult to detect, difficult to monitor, difficult to pay attention to until they're too late. And in that kind of basket of stuff is also, you know, sort of the relationship of a changing climate and the introduction of pathogens that will be exacerbated through those changes. And many of these zoonoses are climate sensitive, or appear in vectors that are climate sensitive. And these vector-borne diseases have increased significantly over the last decade. So, and then you know, add global trade and all that kind of thing, and it becomes really difficult. So we can't help a lot of this that's happening, but we can improve resilience, and we can improve, and resilience is very important. You know, expresses itself in the health of nature and the health of our populations, and that's really where we've got to spend a lot of focus. I'll just say a few words about the fact that the global response on preventing the next pandemic is quite different from what we are doing or need to do here. And, you know, globally, it's really focused on, you know, stopping wildlife trade for consumption, and really looking at where wildlife consumption is really critical, particularly in urban environments. You know, bringing in wildlife from urban areas. You know, China is changing its wildlife laws. Has still, the ban on these markets has stuck. You know, they did have a momentary ban after SARS, which came right back a few months later. So only time will tell if a similar thing happens here. But the longer we're in this, the more critical it becomes, and there's a lot of people paying attention to this. So it does seem like that is working and occurring. But that's going to be, you know, obviously we're not doing any of that. We're just hoping that it will get done, and we're focusing on our own situation here. And we can be helped a great deal by, you know, the WHO manifesto that was issued in May 2020. Number one, this is the World Health Organization, number one, safeguard nature. But all of these things are, you know, important for all of us, all humanity across the globe. And it's not enough to try and prevent the events. At the same time, we have to build the resilience and protection of nature is a key part of this. And you know, for the WHO to say that really, you know, makes us stand up to attention. And it bears mentioning that the importance of the so-called ecological determinants of health is not a new idea. And it's not new for Canada. The first international meeting on human health took place in Ottawa back in 1986 and produced the Ottawa Charter that remains relevant today. I mean, you can find it. It's still a thing. It's very important, and it talks about the prerequisites for human health, including a stable ecosystem and sustainable resources. And today, when you visit the Public Health Agency of Canada website, you can find the following statement, quote, "The protection of natural and built environments and the conservation of natural resources must be addressed in any health promotion strategy." But there's no practical discernible connection between public health and environmental agencies, really, in most cases. I mean, initiatives like this bring that together the most tangibly. Otherwise, they remain resolutely in silos, even though it's pretty well established that our health is strongly influenced by a range of these interacting social, environmental, and cultural economic factors. And it's a long-standing tendency we need to be addressing these in an interrelated fashion, but many of our government agencies are not built to do so. And all this speaks again to the importance of restoring and maintaining ecological integrity where we can and at the watershed scale. And here's a picture right from the Maitland Conservation Authority, Maitland Valley Conservation Authority, and this is how we can picture what this might look like. The social determinants of health, such as economic stability, neighborhood characteristics, education, access to health care, etc., have a very strong history of implementation in Canada. But in spite of our knowledge that ecological factors are also important, that integration is way, way behind in public health programs. Although awareness is increasing. So this is where we kind of have to focus now. And the pandemic has underscored the importance of the environment for human well-being. We're experiencing this so directly. People are flocking to find nature. Southern Ontario exemplifies the huge psychological and mental health benefits that remaining natural areas, which are limited, provide to the large urban population so close by. I mean, the direct emergence of trees, direct experience of trees, natural vistas, solace from noise and congestion, fishing, boating, wildlife viewing, respite from air pollution, which directly affects responses to the COVID-19 disease itself. So these are all so critical and becoming more so. And there's a wider recognition of the meaningful relationships that exist between the well-being of nature, people, and the quality of their surroundings. And this is, wetlands is a really good example of that. And this is kind of a confusing figure, and I'm happy to share the presentation afterwards, but we're really showing that, you can have some proximate impacts that we all know really well about wetland degradation, but, they become more and more, more and more of these impacts become apparent distally, so indirect wise, and wetlands exemplify this so well. I mean, health is another way of describing the condition of an entire ecosystem. And we use it a lot, and we use it in this circumstance here. So that's why talking to you is I feel in very good company in terms of all of these factors. And wetlands have a lot of direct connections to human health, and that are about, generated from biodiversity loss and ecosystem disruption, and this, this intensive agriculture are known drivers of pathogen emergence in certain cases, but also the broader aspects of human and animal health can become really an important indicator, I think, and that's got to be brought in addition to sort of the water monitoring and so on. What's going on the land it becomes very important. And we have to really move to perceptions of nature that we control and dominate to us as part of nature. I don't think I'm saying anything new to this group, but when we think of nature in this fashion, nature becomes an actual asset. And that's more and more the direction that we have to go. And this mindset is inherent in what is being called a One Health approach, where we recognize and take action to retain the essential health links between humans, wildlife, domesticated animals and plants, and all nature, and ensure the conservation and protection of biodiversity, which, interwoven with intact and functional ecosystems, provides the critical foundation of infrastructure of life, health, and well-being on our planet. And that quote comes from Berlin Principles that were issued in 2019, just before this pandemic. WCS, my organization, was a lead in that, and so I really benefit from my colleagues, mostly internationally, on driving this home and the need for this integrated approach, which, again, initiatives like this that are working at the watershed level with a resilience mindset really have the most chance to bring those integrated elements together in the best way possible to work towards this. I only have one more slide, and this again is something that I can share with you that comes from some recent work that's being done more in the context of the relationship between health and human well-being and environmental degradation, resource extraction, and so forth, mostly in northern environments, but a lot of the lessons are really critically the same here. I mean, their points in places that are a lot less trammeled than southern Ontario is that cumulative impacts arise when multiple forms of development occur simultaneously. And so the coexistence of these developments and the interaction between them really make things worse and worse as you go. And so the change in climate and hydrological regime will impact these downstream effects. And so that's why that health of the land is so critical for the health of the water, human well-being, and so on. So I'll end because, while we're talking about social media, it would be great to get some more Twitter followers from this. But in any case, I'm happy to share my slides. And at this point, I'll stop sharing so that if there is any time for questions, I see there's about 10 minutes left in the time that I've allotted. And I hope that was useful. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Justina. I found that absolutely fascinating. So I hope all of my colleagues did as well. We do have some time for questions. So let me just turn it to the group. So you can either come on directly, or if you're not comfortable with that, just put it in the chat, and we'll get everybody's question addressed as best we can. So Phil, you have a question?
I was just going to ask Justina where she would like to see a group like this go from here.
I think groups like this who are naturally integrative, and who are also naturally working at the right scales, and thinking about the connection between land and water is perfect. Perfect, foundation, as are the conservation authorities that make up for it as well. And I think that bringing in public health, I think public health is involved already, and being much more deliberative about coming up with a set of indicators that can be monitored, and bringing in the environmental determinants of human health into the picture. In a two-way circumstance. So not only here, but also to come back and inform the work of the constituent organizations that are part of this broader effort. So the monitoring part is really important, and then some communications also about how important these perspectives are. Many of us have been doing our best recently on highlighting the watershed approach that's so important, that Ontario is known for through the Conservation Authorities approach. And we've done our best in recent months to do so, but more needs to be done, obviously, and it will be even more critical into the future. So I think that's the best way I can answer that question for now, but I really appreciate the platform.
Hey, excellent question, Phil. And thanks, Justina, for a very good answer. We've got time for one more question if anyone has one. If not, I'll ask one, Justina. I'm really interested in the One Health approach. We've started to think about that here at the ministry as well, and the fact that it's all encompassing, right? So it's not only people, but it's communities, it's the environment. Do you see some traction in putting all of those things together, and how do you see that evolving for the future?
Well, I've been tracking Ontario's sort of websites, which are really often my only view as an outsider, to sort of see how Ontario's thinking about it. And I haven't seen much movement from government, but really encouraged to hear that you're talking about it internally. I think it's really important to start showing that externally as much as possible, because it is about the breakdown of silos that's so important, and this forum exemplifies that, of course. There is some more work being done at the federal level as well, but right now, with the public health agency so frankly completely busy, we probably won't be able to have the full set of conversations until after this is over. But I think it's really a great sign that agriculture and environment and so on are getting prepared for that, and hopefully we'll see more external communications to that effect, because people need to know that outside, how important that is.
Yeah. In terms of government, we're doing some strategic planning, and in our division we have the meat inspection program, fruit and vegetable inspection, we have the environment, and economic development. And we just see that they do fit so nicely together into a One Health concept. So good for you guys for sharing that.
Yeah, and particularly if that comes into play at the watershed scale, and that would require integration well beyond the ministry itself, but over to OM&RF and MOECP and municipal as well, public and health. So those, it's that interagency aspect that becomes so critical too.
Yeah, and that collaboration piece that we've been talking about so much this morning already. So anyway, thank you.
And I had a couple of questions to me privately, just to ask me if I can share the presentation. I'm happy to do that.
Okay, great.
So I'll just send that to Ted, because
Ted.
he's the, I'll send it in PDF, and I welcome any other interactions, and just really appreciate the opportunity and the great work that you guys are doing.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you for your time this morning. It was very educational.